Evil, as an adjective, refers to that which is morally reprehensible, sinful, or wicked. It can also describe something harmful or disastrous, that is, natural evils. Thus, as a noun, evil refers to a force, event, or actions that bring sorrow, destruction, or pain. As it relates to theology, now comes the question that breaks every apologist. If God was the only thing that existed prior to the creation of the universe, where else could evil have come from? Even if apologists want to put the blame for evil as a practice on human free will, who made humans with free will? And moreover, who knew that the usage of human free will would lead to the practice of evil? At the very least, God is responsible for setting up a universe in which evil is able to take place. The logic is inescapable. As a syllogism, if God is all that existed before the universe, and if God made the universe, and if it can be said evil exists within this universe, conclusion, God created the circumstances which allow evil to occur. If one considers the premises to be true, the conclusion follows necessarily. Welcome to another episode of Noah's Snark. I'm atheist Joseph Vina. Isaiah chapter 45 verse 7 in the King James Version of the Bible, which is the crappiest version of the Bible, is the primary verse often cited for God being the author of evil, even if we're just talking about natural evil, stating, "I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things." Contextually, this refers to God's absolute sovereignty, with many scholars translating evil as calamity, disaster, or judgment rather than moral wickedness, which is why I mentioned natural evil. In Hebrew, the word ra, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, that means evil, in this verse is frequently translated in modern versions as calamity, disaster, or woe, referring to the hardships used for divine judgment or discipline. But what about moral evil? If we add to our definition I gave in the beginning, if we define moral evil as those thoughts or actions by free agents that disturb or are in defiance of God's will or authority, that would raise some questions. What comes to mind first for me is, how was Lucifer able to defy God in heaven? Do all angels have free will? So if there's free will in heaven, does that mean anyone granted a stay in heaven with God could potentially be cast out? That's if one interprets heaven as a place where things can happen this way. And if God designated Lucifer/Satan as so terrible in their defiance, why does he allow Satan free rein to corrupt human beings? Knowing the effect Satan would have on human beings, whose influence God would prefer humans not fall prey to, seems in itself somewhat evil to allow a corrupting force to run loose. Many apologists will tell you, okay, well, it's for the sake of testing the faithful, but that to me, that's kind of a dick move, to create a supernatural being that can sin, put them in a world where sin is possible, allow that unseeable supernatural agent loose to influence human beings, which by the way looks a lot like neurobiological changes in the brain, to see if people stay faithful to God in order to reap the reward of returning to the presence of God from which they came. Which is to say, like the universe, where else would souls have come from if God was all that existed prior to the universe? Why would he deny a piece of his own being from returning to its source, or even let that bit of himself be influenced by Satan? You see, once you start digging, none of it makes sense. Strangely, and sorry for the further digression, believers don't agree on when Lucifer fell from heaven. Why is that important? If Lucifer fell from heaven before mankind was created, this would imply evil, as the transgression of God's law, already existed. If Lucifer fell after mankind was created, that could imply evil infected, so to speak, heaven. That bastion of reliable answers that is gotanswers.org says that Lucifer fell before the creation of mankind. Other Christians and Muslims believe it was after man's creation, that man's creation was the catalyst for Lucifer's rebellion. Not that it really matters, since, as I've said many times, God bears the responsibility for creating the circumstances that allow evil to occur, if he exists. There's simply no way around that, as I mentioned. Okay, sorry for the tangent. Damn you, Satan. Here's an important question worth considering for the believer, a question about the origins of evil that I want to ask, and I've never gotten a good answer to this. If the believer doesn't believe Adam and Eve were two actual people, that the story of the fall and original sin is allegorical, how are we born with original sin, that generational curse God placed upon people? If that's one's theology, which seems to be a popular one. How did evil come into the world if the story of Genesis is allegorical? Well, again, it would have to have come from God, or have to have been done by God. One might answer God simply created people at some point, even maybe through evolution, but he still would have created agents capable of sin and placed them in a world where sin could occur. The responsibility could lay nowhere else but on God's shoulders. This is where the apologist typically gives up and says, yes, well, the occurrence or the allowance of evil is for some greater good, but they can never say what this greater good is, or even with all the evil, there's more good in the world than there is evil, which is an assertion in search of basically any evidence. I just can't get behind the idea that a person who is raped, tortured, and murdered serves some greater purpose, because the victim, especially that person, would be the first to say that God can take his greater good and shove it up his ass. Oh, the apologist will chime in, the victim will be compensated in heaven. Bullshit. If that victim was a non-believer, which is the greatest offense to God, laughably more so than rape or murder, that victim is not getting any restitution, at least according to many apologists I've heard. Where's the greater good then? Where does the good apply? The early Gnostic Christians thought the God that created the world was a lesser evil God, and that Jesus was sent by the one true loving God to impart knowledge of what was truly divine. This perspective, in my opinion, and if I were a Christian of any sort, would make way more sense than any other apologetics regarding the theological origins of evil. Unsurprisingly, modern Christians cannot accept the idea their God didn't create everything, which is weird because they don't accept God as either the author or agent ultimately responsible for the existence of evil. And you know what that's called, kids? That's called cognitive dissonance. And what do most people do when faced with such a dilemma? Well, if they've got to pick one or the other, they've got to go with the belief that makes themselves or the people they support look better. Deep down, though, we know it doesn't make sense to them, and if it doesn't make sense to them, why would they expect it to make sense to any non-believer? And that's all I have to say about that, at least for today. Thank you for listening to Noah's Snark Podcast. I'm Atheist Joseph Vina. Until next time, revel in reason and love the logical.